Between 1965 and 1978, 16 men who had taken vows of silence, obedience, and humility vanished from Holy Cross Abbey in rural Virginia. Official records marked them as transferred or released at request, but no community ever received them. The abbey remained silent, the church offered no comment, and families were discouraged from asking questions. Hidden in the Appalachian foothills, the monastery had long been praised for its contemplative discipline and ascetic purity. But something hollow echoed behind the stone walls, something that could not be prayed away. Founded in 1849 by Cistercian missionaries, Holy Cross Abbey grew into one of the most respected monastic institutions in the American South. Known for its self-sustaining agricultural life, theological scholarship, and strict adherence to the rule of St. Benedict, the abbey became a pilgrimage site by the mid-20th century. Tourists visited its serene gardens, purchased the monks' famous fruitcake, and attended retreats led by men who had renounced the outside world. But beneath this tranquil image lay a more complex reality. With aging infrastructure, dwindling vocations, and increasing isolation, the abbey entered a period of quiet deterioration. What outsiders called holy discipline, insiders described, years later, as psychological warfare. Now beginning. The front gate to Holy Cross Abbey was made of wrought iron, sunburned with rust, and creaked so loudly that locals claimed you could hear it from half a mile away on still mornings. Visitors rarely arrived unannounced. When they did, they were met with polite deflection at the gatehouse, or a long, silent wait in the gravel lot, until someone in robes came to usher them away with smiles that did not reach the eyes. From the county's perspective, the abbey was a tranquil success. It paid its taxes. It rarely called law enforcement. It produced well-reviewed religious texts and won praise in diocesan newsletters for its discipline and modesty. In 1971, a television crew from Richmond aired a 6-minute profile titled "Peace in the Hills," showing monks praying, baking bread, and tending vineyards. They wore plain habits. Their heads were shaved. The narration spoke of renewal and reverence, but few knew the abbey's inner structures. Fewer still ever entered the dormitory hall or the subterranean archives, where rows of locked drawers held decades of files written in Latin and stored under a strict classification system known only to the prior and his assistants. Even the diocesan leadership seemed content to let the abbey run itself. It had operated in near-total autonomy since the 1930s, when its last bishop-overseer died of heart failure, and no replacement was ever formally appointed. During this time, the monks lived on 120 acres of farmland and forested hills, most of which was off-limits to guests. Trails were marked with simple wooden signs: Ora, Labora, and Private, Do Not Enter. The public saw the guest chapel, the bakery, and the retreat center, a stone building with sparse rooms and crucifixes above each bed. Those who stayed overnight described the silence as overwhelming. Some said it was beautiful. Others said it felt like being watched. The monastery's spiritual leader during these years was Abbot Matthias Lorne, a quiet man from Ohio with a background in philosophy and canon law. Ordained in the 1940s, he rose through clerical ranks with little fanfare and took over Holy Cross in 1962. He wrote extensively about self-denial, the discipline of silence, and the dangers of what he called external temptation. His letters to the Order's leadership in France, later uncovered by reporters, hinted at a desire for stricter boundaries between monks and the outside world. He called the abbey an ark for the true faith in a time of decadent noise. Under his leadership, new protocols were introduced: tighter schedules, fewer public appearances, restrictions on correspondence. A monk could not write a letter without prior approval. Guests could not be hosted without 2 witnesses present. Retreat visits were limited to 3 days, and even then, all interactions were to occur in common areas under supervision. Some praised these changes as a return to authentic Benedictine discipline. Others whispered about control. A former groundskeeper who worked on the edge of the property in 1974 recalled seeing monks digging trenches at night under lamplight. He said they sang as they worked. He quit after 1 season, citing a feeling he couldn't shake. Despite its distance from the public eye, Holy Cross was no stranger to internal transition. Monks came and went, or so it seemed. New novices arrived every few years. Others were said to have returned to civilian life, suffering from spiritual exhaustion or disillusionment. But what no one noticed at first was the irregular pattern in the disappearances. In 1965, Brother Paul DeWitt, aged 31, was listed as having departed for reassignment. No one could say to where. In 1967, Brother Thomas R., aged 28, was said to have requested laicization, yet no formal documentation existed in diocesan archives. In 1969, two novices, Michael F. and Jerome K., were removed from the rolls within the same week. The Abbey attributed this to vocational discernment. Their families never heard from them again. By 1973, 4 more monks had vanished, each under similarly vague circumstances. Records were stamped, but names were not forwarded to receiving institutions. No forwarding addresses were listed. A priest in Charleston remembered receiving a call from someone at the Abbey asking about housing availability, but no monk ever arrived. He later said the call felt rehearsed, as if the person on the other end was reading from a script. None of this caused alarm at the time. The church, after all, had its own bureaucratic rhythm. People moved. Files got lost. The Abbey maintained its exterior charm, and for many that was enough. Tourists still came in October to watch the leaves change. The bakery expanded. A new retreat catalogue was printed in 1976, featuring testimonials from grateful visitors. But behind the stone walls, changes in personnel had begun to feel less like spiritual turnover and more like subtraction. In the private journal of Father Raymond L., found decades later in a diocesan storage room, the tone was cautious. He wrote, "There are rooms that haven't been opened in months. At dinner, there are fewer voices. No one speaks of Paul anymore, or Michael, or Thomas. I asked where Brother D was last week, and was told, do not concern yourself. I'm beginning to forget faces." By the end of 1978, 16 monks had left the Abbey's roster without reappearing anywhere else. The institution said little. Most of the families never spoke publicly. In some cases, letters were returned unopened. In others, no return came at all. The silence at Holy Cross Abbey was not merely a monastic tradition. Over time, it became a culture of avoidance, a tool of internal containment. Novices were trained not just in prayer, but in discretion. They were told that questions signaled ego, that curiosity threatened the soul. Speaking without permission was discouraged. Eye contact during meals was frowned upon. Even gestures became minimal. Those who arrived from seminaries or city parishes found themselves disoriented by the slow erasure of individual identity. Brother Matthew I, who entered the Abbey in 1970 and left in 1974 under ambiguous terms, later gave a deposition to a canon lawyer investigating irregularities in property records. In his statement, he described a thick quiet, not of peace but of fear. He recounted daily routines that moved like machinery. Bells rang at fixed intervals. Meals were taken in near darkness. One night, he was awoken to assist with moving boxes from the cellar to a shed. He was not told why. He said he saw files, folders, a reel-to-reel recorder. When he asked, the prior told him, "Your obedience is more valuable than your understanding." Visitors continued to admire the grounds. In summer, the hills rolled green behind the cloister walls. Local photographers used the site for wedding portraits, though none were allowed inside. A man from Roanoke, hired to repair roof tiles in 1975, told his wife he was not permitted to enter certain wings. He said the attic floor was boarded from within. When he asked why, the monk escorting him said simply, "That part of the house sleeps." The language used by those who remained at Holy Cross was often opaque. They spoke of detachment, cleansing, and total surrender. These phrases appeared again and again in the Abbey's annual reports, alongside budgetary notes and supply inventories. Even in financial documents, the tone was devotional. One line item in 1977 read, "Increased linen stock for novitiate fasting period." Another said, "Allocated stipend for temporary enclosure of outer cells." For those on the outside, particularly families of missing monks, communication was nearly impossible. Letters went unanswered. Some parents received a brief note typed unsigned, stating that their son had discerned a new path and wished no further contact. In several cases, the wording was identical, suggesting a template. A woman from Ohio, whose brother disappeared from the Abbey in 1968, said she drove to the gates and waited 2 days before anyone came to speak with her. When a monk finally appeared, he told her, "Your prayers should be for his peace, not your closure." Inside the Abbey, compliance was reinforced not through overt punishment, but through systemic withdrawal. A monk who spoke too often might find his work duties changed, moved from vineyards to cleaning latrines. One who asked persistent questions might be reassigned to remote prayer cabins in the upper woods, where meals were delivered once daily and conversations were not permitted. These cabins, built in the early 1950s for contemplative retreat, became unofficial holding zones. Once a monk was placed there, he rarely returned to the main cloister. Brother Dennis J., who served as infirmarian from 1969 to 1975, kept a series of handwritten logs cataloguing medication dosages, sleep irregularities, and dietary notes for those in isolation. Though his notes were dry in tone, patterns emerged. Several entries referenced extreme fatigue without clear cause. Others cited persistent vocal murmuring during fasts. One monk was recorded as refusing food for 6 days before being transferred. No record indicated where he had gone. The diocese continued to file the Abbey's updates without challenge. Bishops changed, departments shifted, but the monastery remained untouched. Its isolation worked in its favor. With no neighboring parishes and no active seminary pipeline, Holy Cross became an administrative afterthought. When the Abbey sent reports listing monks as having departed peacefully, there were no follow-ups. The files were stamped, shelved, and forgotten. By the late 1970s, the community had shrunk to fewer than 20 monks, down from over 40 a decade earlier. Yet no official alarm was raised. A retreat coordinator from Baltimore who visited in 1978 remarked on the small attendance at Mass. He was told that some brothers were on long-term silent retreat. When he asked to send thank you letters to the monks who had guided his group, he was told names were not shared for reasons of humility. Even as questions lingered, the Abbey preserved its public face. A new line of hand-printed liturgical booklets was released. A traveling exhibition on monastic life featured photographs taken on the grounds, always outdoors, always with faces turned away. The public saw the gardens, the grapevines, the chapel. They did not see the boarded attic, the sealed lower vault, or the wooden path that led to the forest cabins. One particular incident, later described by a visiting scholar, offered a glimpse into the hidden systems of the Abbey. In 1976, Father Leo P., a historian of religious architecture, was granted temporary access to the cloister archives under the pretense of documenting 19th century construction techniques. He was assigned a monk escort who remained silent throughout. While reviewing blueprints, he noticed discrepancies in the layout. A corridor shown in early maps was missing in current ones. A set of steps leading below the chapel was no longer marked. When he inquired, he was told those records were inaccurate. But when he examined the structure in person, he saw indications of a sealed door, brickwork that did not match, a faint draft where none should have been. When he returned the following day, the room had been locked and his access privileges revoked. He left the Abbey 2 days early and wrote to a colleague that he felt, "There are corners there that memory itself has been trained to avoid." His report was never published. Over time, the missing monks became less of a presence in the minds of those who remained. New novices were not told their names. The old photographs were quietly removed. In the scriptorium, where monks once copied and bound texts, the walls were bare by 1979. The large group photo from 1958, which once hung outside the refectory, disappeared. No one asked where it had gone. Outside observers, when they noticed the Abbey at all, saw only a quiet place fading gently into obscurity. Few guessed how meticulously that obscurity had been managed. The absences were not accidental. They were embedded in the Abbey's structure, as deliberate as the rhythms of prayer or the tending of vines. It would take years, and the persistence of a few who refused to stop asking, for the silence to unravel. The earliest indications that something was amiss did not come from within the church. but from those tasked with maintaining the margins. Delivery drivers, septic workers, and utility inspectors, those who were allowed on the property but rarely inside, began to compare stories in small circles across Clark County. These were not men inclined to dramatize. They recounted oddities plainly, in barbershops and hardware stores, as things that just didn't sit right. One such account came from Alvin Crosley, a technician contracted by the county in 1972 to assess a failing drainage system near the Abbey's southern field. He arrived with a clipboard and rubber boots, expecting to inspect runoff patterns and note erosion. Instead, he was guided not to the site in question, but to a different slope altogether. The monk who met him, an elderly man who introduced himself only as Brother W., insisted the records were incorrect and offered no further explanation. Crossley followed his guidance and completed the job, but weeks later, after examining old surveyor maps, he realized he had been diverted nearly half a mile from the actual problem area. When he returned to request a second visit, he was told it was no longer necessary. "They'd rather let the soil cave in than let me see what's under it," he later told a neighbor. Another story came from a nurse named Rachel M., who in 1975 worked for a mobile hospice program. She was sent to the Abbey after a call reported an elderly man in need of palliative care. When she arrived, she was kept at the gatehouse for nearly 40 minutes. Finally, a monk arrived and informed her that the patient had already passed. She was given no name, no time of death, no records to file. She returned to her supervisor with nothing but a note scribbled on monastic stationery. Eternal rest granted. These small anomalies, individually unremarkable, slowly gathered weight among those who passed near the Abbey without ever entering its core. Patterns began to form. Repeated requests for external inspections were delayed or denied. Work orders were signed by initials only. At least 3 individuals who had been assigned jobs on Abbey property between 1969 and 1978 filed change of assignment requests, citing discomfort and refusal of access. But the most persistent signs came from within, filtered out through those few who left the community and carried fragments of it with them. One such figure was Brother Henry A., who exited the Abbey in early 1977 under unclear circumstances. He was not formally laicized, nor was he reassigned. He simply appeared, months later, living in the basement of a Jesuit retreat center in Maryland. His speech was slow and often wandered. He did not respond to his old name. He signed notes as Servus Quietis and refused to eat if music played in the room. Staff at the center, unsure how to help, contacted the diocese. A quiet inquiry was made, but no follow-up occurred. Months later, Brother Henry disappeared from the center altogether, leaving behind only a cloth satchel containing hand-copied scripture and a small wooden carving with no identifying marks. Another former monk, known in records only as L., wrote a series of unsigned letters to a local priest in Fairfax. The letters were written in careful cursive, some in Latin, others in English. In one, dated March 1978, he described voices that were not prayed but spoken into you. He claimed the Abbey's isolation was not accidental, but cultivated. He did not accuse anyone directly, but he described being placed in the northern chamber for reflection, where he said he could not tell day from night. The priest who received the letters showed them to the archdiocese. They were archived and not discussed again. More indirect clues surfaced through fiscal records. Though the Abbey had long prided itself on financial self-sufficiency, its account books told a different story in the mid-1970s. Payments to contractors rose sharply, yet the work being done was never clarified. A full-time driver was added to the payroll, though no deliveries increased. In 1976, a line item appeared for interior relocation, listed 3 times under separate accounts. No explanation was given. When pressed, Abbey officials cited renovations, but no renovations were visible. Visitors noted that the structures appeared unchanged. If anything, they were aging faster. Plaster crumbled from arches in the guest wing. Roof tiles slipped and were not replaced. Yet funds were spent, and invoices were marked complete. A young seminarian named Daniel M. made note of this during a brief residency at Holy Cross in the summer of 1977. Sent by his order for a period of discernment, he was assigned menial tasks and quiet observation. His journal, later recovered from diocesan storage, recounted discrepancies between stated activity and observed reality. "There is a list of men who work the vineyard," he wrote, "but I have only seen 3. I was told there are 18. The rest are contemplative or not receiving visitors." He also noted the sound of something being moved beneath the chapel floor at night. Metal on stone repeated, but no one admits hearing it. His stay was cut short after just 6 weeks. The official reason was spiritual incompatibility. But letters to his mentor suggest he had raised too many questions too quickly. In one note he wrote, "They are good men, but not all of them are here to pray." There were no formal accusations during this period, no public inquiries. Yet beneath the surface, documents and voices began to form a pattern. An archivist from a nearby diocese, charged in 1978 with digitizing old property files, noted that several transfer records from Holy Cross were marked with 2 different dates. In each case, the earlier date was handwritten and later crossed out. The second date aligned with feast days, times of celebration, distraction, and increased visitation. It was as if departures were being retroactively sanitized to match the Abbey's liturgical calendar. What emerged was a quiet choreography of a mission. Details were shifted, timelines adjusted, names fell away, and the silences, once considered spiritual, began to resemble something else entirely. It was not until a fire damaged a section of the retreat center's archive room in late 1978 that the first internal alarms were raised. The blaze was small and contained, but during cleanup, a locked drawer was forced open by maintenance staff. Inside were sealed envelopes, each marked with a name and a 4-digit number. None of the names matched current residents. Some matched monks previously listed as transferred. Others did not appear anywhere in the Abbey's records. When the drawer's contents were brought to the attention of Abbot Matthias, his response was immediate. He ordered the drawer removed, its contents destroyed, and the maintenance worker reassigned. The archivist on duty that day submitted a quiet resignation 2 weeks later. She did not provide a reason. In the months following the archive room fire, subtle changes overtook the Abbey's daily operations. Schedules were tightened. Access was further restricted. The retreat center stopped accepting overnight guests. Notices were sent to parishes announcing a period of internal renewal, and reservations were postponed indefinitely. No explanation accompanied the letters. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere grew heavier. Monks who had previously led chants began attending services in silence. Communal meals, once held at long wooden tables, were split into staggered shifts. When asked, the prior explained that this was to encourage deeper reflection. Yet to those who had lived there for decades, the change felt corrective, not contemplative. Brother Elian M., one of the few who remained from the 1950s cohort, later described the period as a time when breathing itself felt supervised. He had taken vows of silence decades earlier, but even he found the silence unsettling. Rooms were emptied without notice. Names disappeared from rosters. Once he returned from gardening to find his cell had been reassigned. His belongings were gone, replaced by a cot and a note. Pray elsewhere. The Abbey's gardens, long a source of pride, began to show neglect. Weeds overtook rows of lavender and sage. Tools were left uncollected in the soil. The vineyard, once trimmed with geometric precision, grew wild at its edges. When Father Gregory W., the monk responsible for its upkeep, was asked about the change, he replied only, "Some fruit must be left unharvested." Visitors were no longer permitted beyond the guest wing. Even deliveries were now received at a new checkpoint near the base of the gravel road. Drivers reported being met by monks wearing dark hoods who signed for packages without speaking. One noted that the signature on his invoice was not a name, but the letter C. He shrugged it off but told his wife, "They've gone deeper into whatever they're doing up there." What had begun as minor irregularities had, by late 1978, hardened into a perimeter. The Abbey was no longer simply private. It had become opaque. Its leadership offered no public statements. The diocese maintained its silence, and within the cloister, an internal code took hold. Ask less, endure more. It was during this period that the Abbey's infirmary was quietly relocated from the south wing to a smaller annex building near the rear of the property. No announcement was made. The change was discovered only when a groundskeeper arrived with a cart of linens and found the room emptied. Beds, records, cabinets, everything gone. The annex had previously served as a storage space for liturgical vestments. Its conversion was never logged in the monastery's maintenance ledger. Yet within 2 weeks, the building was outfitted with blackout curtains and a new lock system. Brother Lucas R., a former carpenter who assisted with the renovation, later claimed the modifications had not been designed by anyone within the Abbey. Blueprints had arrived from outside, along with specific instructions. No windows were to be left unsealed, and interior walls were to be reinforced. Lucas completed the work, received his stipend, and left the order shortly after. His exit letter, preserved in an independent clerical archive, contained only one line: "If illness cannot be spoken of, it is not healing." Meanwhile, correspondence from the Abbey became increasingly vague. Quarterly newsletters stopped listing the names of professed monks. Instead, phrases like "those in contemplation" or "the silent ones" replaced individual references. A donor from Richmond, concerned about a check that had gone unacknowledged, drove to the Abbey unannounced. She was met at the gate by a monk who informed her that financial inquiries were now handled through prayer. She returned home unsettled and contacted a local deacon, who advised her to let the matter rest. "Their ways are not our ways," he wrote in a note she kept in her Bible. Throughout the winter of 1978, snowfall accumulated around the Abbey, muffling sound and further isolating the grounds. The winding road became impassable for days at a time. No retreatants visited. No masses were offered publicly. Within the stone corridors, a deeper quiet settled, so complete that monks reported hearing the hum of electrical fixtures as if amplified. It was during this silence that Brother Stephen F., a middle-aged monk known for his bookkeeping, began to notice changes in the community's internal ledgers. Supplies were being redirected, cots were removed from general dormitories and listed as relocated. Food stocks, particularly in the infirmary category, had tripled, yet the visible population of the Abbey had decreased. Stephen, meticulous in his work, noted these shifts in margin comments. Each notation was simple: unusual, verify, no request logged. None of his annotations were acknowledged. One evening in March, he returned to the scriptorium and found his ledger drawer locked. His keys no longer worked. He was informed that bookkeeping would now be centralized. When he asked for clarification, the prior said only, "The numbers belong to the silence now." Stephen left the Abbey 6 weeks later. His departure was not dramatic. He packed quietly, left his robes folded on his cot, and walked the 12 miles to a small friary in the next county. He refused to discuss what prompted his decision. When asked what he needed, he requested a room with a window. Back at Holy Cross, the changes continued. By April, several paths on the Abbey grounds were closed off entirely. Wooden signs with Latin inscriptions were placed at key junctions. One read, "Tacere est vivere." Another, "Non omnis exitus est fuga." Brother Adrian, responsible for translating spiritual texts, offered interpretations to a retreatant who happened to read Latin. "To be silent is to live," he said of the first. The second he hesitated on, then translated as, "Not every departure is escape." It was around this time that rumors began to circulate within surrounding parishes. A priest in Staunton spoke obliquely in a homily about walls that keep not only the world out but the soul within. Another, in a confession to a colleague, mentioned a monk who had arrived at his rectory disoriented and unable to sleep indoors. The monk's robes were torn, and he asked not for shelter but for a field where he could lie without hearing bells. No official complaints were filed. Throughout the spring, the Abbey's rhythms continued. Chants echoed at appointed times. Meals were served. Gardens remained wild, but not abandoned. From a distance, nothing had changed. Yet within, the Abbey was no longer a house of quiet reflection. It had become something else entirely, not a sanctuary but a threshold, and those within it were no longer simply choosing silence, they were learning to survive it. The first tangible breach in the Abbey's silence came not from an act of protest or rebellion, but from a misplaced ledger. It was discovered by Father Lionel C., a diocesan archivist performing routine record reconciliation in the spring of 1979. The document, tucked behind older financial reports in a mislabeled folder, bore no signature but contained itemized lists written in tight, precise handwriting. The header read simply, "Transfers internal." At first glance it resembled any other supply manifest. Dates, initials, quantities. But as Lionel reviewed the contents, a pattern became clear. The listed items were not goods, they were names. 16 entries in total, each associated with a sequence of dates followed by locations marked with abbreviations he did not recognize. Several names matched monks who had been officially listed as transferred over the past decade. Others did not appear in any known records. One name stood out, Jerome K., a novice who had entered in 1967 and whose departure had never been confirmed. Next to his name, 3 dates were listed. The final entry read B7. Lionel, confused, cross-referenced the file against diocesan personnel logs. Nothing matched. The abbreviations were not associated with any known parishes or monastic orders. He brought the file to his supervisor, who advised him to set it aside for now. When Lionel pressed the issue, he was reassigned to parish records in Roanoke and advised not to travel without prior notice. Unwilling to let the matter drop, Lionel began reaching out to others quietly. Among those he contacted was a retired monastic scholar, Sister Ruth H., who had once visited Holy Cross during a theological exchange in the late 1960s. Though she had not returned since, she remembered the Abbey well. When Lionel presented the abbreviations to her, she immediately recognized the sequence. B7, she explained, was not a destination. It was a classification. A coded reference used internally by several cloistered communities to designate monks under disciplinary retreat. Most such retreats were temporary, but the document Lionel found showed durations extending years, sometimes without end. "This isn't record-keeping," she told him. "It's inventory." The phrase haunted Lionel. He began compiling notes, quietly interviewing former staff and retreatants. His work remained unofficial, tucked into binders and filed under vague labels. He feared retaliation, but more than that, he feared erasure. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that what had happened at Holy Cross had not been mismanagement. It had been design. Meanwhile, back at the Abbey, cracks began to form. A letter arrived at the Chancery in July 1979, unsigned and postmarked from a nearby town. It read, "There are still 5 in the northern cabins, no one checks on them. One of them sings at night. Please send someone who doesn't wear a robe." The handwriting was uneven. There were smudges along the margin. The letter was passed up the chain without response, but a copy reached Lionel, who filed it alongside his growing dossier. He began marking the cabin locations on a map, using aerial photographs and old survey records. The northern quadrant of the Abbey property was seldom discussed in official documents. Footpaths led to it, but there were no structures listed. No electrical lines, no sanitation access. He contacted a former forestry intern who had conducted a biodiversity study in the area in 1974. The intern, now a university lecturer, remembered the assignment clearly. "They told me not to enter that quadrant," he said. "Said the soil was unstable, but I saw boot tracks, fresh ones, leading in and out." Lionel's notes grew. He labeled folders with terms borrowed from the monk's own lexicon. Contemplative hold, silent class, perpetual retreat. Each term correlated with a period during which a monk had reportedly vanished from public record, but remained by all available accounts on the Abbey grounds. What disturbed him most was the duration. Several entries indicated these retreats lasted not weeks or months, but years. No ecclesiastical review appeared to follow, no pastoral assessments, just movement. A monk would disappear from communal life, reappear briefly on a ledger, then vanish again. In August, Lionel contacted a canon law professor at a Jesuit seminary in Pennsylvania. He presented the case as hypothetical. The professor listened quietly, then said, "If it's true, it's not canon law, it's containment." At Holy Cross, the quiet deepened. Fewer monks were seen outside. The bell tower, once rung by hand at set intervals, was now automated. Its sound changed, slightly hollow, thinner, as if echoing off different surfaces. Locals who lived near the forested border noted that wildlife had become scarce. Paths used by deer and foxes now led nowhere. One hunter, trespassing one morning before dawn, claimed he saw figures standing in a line near the old stone wall, not speaking, not moving. They weren't watching, he said later, but they weren't praying either. He never returned to the property. In September, Lionel attempted a final step. He contacted the provincial superior of the Cistercian order in North America and requested a meeting. He presented his findings, including copies of the ledger, the aerial maps, the letter, and a summary of names. The superior listened politely, then asked, "Why you? Why now?" Lionel had no answer. 2 weeks later, his contract with the diocese was not renewed. The binder containing his notes disappeared from his office. But not before Sister Ruth made copies. She had sensed the trajectory of the inquiry and had quietly duplicated the most relevant documents. She stored them in her convent library under a false category, liturgical music studies restricted. Years later, when researchers rediscovered the files, the label was still intact. Inside, they found dates, initials, maps, and a final note in Lionel's hand. If they are still there, someone must look, not for answers, for proof of presence. At Holy Cross, the grounds remained undisturbed. The gravel road curled through trees that grew thicker each year. The chapel still echoed with measured chants, and the cabins to the north, unseen, unmarked, stood as they always had. But somewhere in the silence, something had shifted. The following winter, a man named Robert Elkins arrived in Clark County. He was not clergy nor a former retreatant, but a civil investigator employed by a private legal group in Washington. His background was not ecclesiastical, it was administrative. Elkins specialized in institutional negligence claims, primarily in elder care facilities and residential schools. What drew him to Holy Cross was not the theology, but the numbers. A retired diocesan accountant, acting under condition of anonymity, had flagged a cluster of endowments made in the early 1970s by families who believed their sons remained in residence at the Abbey. These donations, still drawing from frozen trust accounts, had not been redirected, refunded, or closed. In 2 cases, the Abbey had continued sending acknowledgements up to 5 years after the associated monk's last known appearance. The families, assuming all was well, had ceased direct contact. Elkins, reviewing the financial trail, was struck by a lack of external oversight. No audits had been performed since 1969. The diocese, while nominally connected, had long ago ceased regular visits. When he contacted the regional office under a different name, posing as a donor, he was sent a trifold brochure printed in 1974. The contact number was no longer active. He arrived at the Abbey unannounced in January 1980. Snow blanketed the drive and the iron gate stood open. A monk met him at the edge of the property, requested identification, then declined to grant entry. Elkins made note of the encounter in his log. The man's tone was not rude, he wrote, but recited, memorized, as though issuing a policy he no longer understood. He attempted to follow up by letter. No response came. Undeterred, Elkins focused his efforts on those who had once worked near the Abbey. Retired groundskeepers, laundry workers, and hospice staff formed a quiet constellation around the monastery. Some had only brief contact. Others, like Judith M., a nurse who had delivered medication monthly in the mid-70s, provided more detailed recollections. Judith remembered the northern path. She had never walked it, but she had seen it from the laundry shed. There were crates brought out in twos, she recalled, carried, never wheeled, marked with initials but always the same hand. When asked if she knew who received them, she shook her head. They came back empty. Her memory was clear on one point. A monk named Father Eli, gentle and often assigned to greeting workers, had vanished sometime in 1976. She had liked him. When she asked about him the following month, she was told he had entered the deep prayer. No further explanation was given. Another former staff member, Raymond T., described a set of keys he once glimpsed on a supervisor's belt. Each was tagged with colored tape. The red one, he said, was never used in front of others. When it left his side, Raymond said, "You didn't see him again that day." Elkins cross-referenced these accounts with supply orders, electrical logs, and weather reports. In 3 separate instances between 1975 and 1978, he identified anomalies in energy usage during periods when no guests were present. One spike coincided with an ice storm. The Abbey reported a power outage, yet usage records suggested otherwise. Power had been rerouted, not lost. He presented his findings to a private panel specializing in non-profit oversight. The panel reviewed his documentation, then declined to investigate. "Without a formal complaint from a family," one member told him privately, "we'd be investigating shadows." Still, Elkins persisted. He located the last known address of brother Paul DeWitt's sister, Mary. She lived alone in a brick duplex outside of Harrisburg. When he knocked, she opened the door halfway. She was in her 70s. Her brother had vanished in 1965. Elkins asked if she had ever received an explanation. "Not one," she said. "Only a note that he was well." He showed her a copy of the internal ledger from the monastery. Her brother's name appeared beside a sequence of dates and the letter C. She studied it silently, then walked into another room. When she returned, she was holding a small wooden box. Inside was a stack of letters, all identical. Postmarked once a year, every year for 9 years. They bore no return address. The contents were brief. "I am well. I pray for you." Each one signed Paul. The handwriting, Mary said, was not his. Back in Clark County, the Abbey held its Lenten observances. The guest chapel remained closed. Bells continued to ring. A new sign was erected near the outer gate. "Not open to public, rebuilding interior." There was no construction equipment on the grounds. In early March, a satellite image captured during a forest conservation survey revealed a set of disturbed clearings in the northern quadrant. The paths leading to them were narrow but visible. No structures could be seen, but 2 parallel lines of soil disruption extended east to west. When Elkins obtained a copy of the image through a contact at the land registry, he marked the location against Sister Ruth's map. They matched precisely. In April, Elkins submitted a formal inquiry to the state's Department of Religious Corporations. The request was filed, stamped, and acknowledged. No investigation followed. 3 weeks later, he received a typed letter at his home address. It contained no salutation, no signature, and no return name. It read, "There are no monks missing, only those who are still praying." Elkins filed the letter with the rest of his documents. At the convent where Sister Ruth resided, a decision was made to transfer the copies she had preserved to a secure diocesan archive under her control. The sisters were uneasy. One spoke privately of a recurring sound, paper rustling when no one was in the library, steps outside the storage room. Nothing was found. Ruth herself had begun to suffer from poor sleep. She kept a small lamp lit in her room at all times. When asked, she said she feared not being found, but being remembered incorrectly. By May, all official inquiries into Holy Cross Abbey had ceased. Its name was no longer mentioned in regional circulars. The vineyard was never harvested that year. In the years following the quiet withdrawal of Holy Cross Abbey from public view, the property faded from institutional memory. The diocese, facing restructuring, removed it from its active roster in 1983. Officially, it became a non-operational contemplative site, listed alongside mission ruins and uninhabited chapels. The grounds were still owned by the order, but no active ministry was reported. The listing included a note, "Not open for visitation. Internal renewal continues." Locals referred to it simply as the closed place. By 1986, the surrounding county had changed. A small highway widened the access corridor, and with it came new homes, a gas station, and a campground just 3 miles west of the monastery gates. The gravel road that once led only to silence now carried hikers, delivery vans, and seasonal visitors. Most passed by without noticing the iron gate, its hinges rusted into place. A few stopped to take pictures of the moss-covered arch, mistaking it for a historical marker. One of these visitors, Thomas Rains, had recently moved to the area to work on environmental surveying. He was not interested in religious history, but in the impact of runoff from older institutions on nearby water tables. When he learned of the Abbey's location, he obtained permission from the county to conduct soil and water sampling near the northern slope. He expected outdated septic lines or fertilizer residues. What he found was silence, and a path still maintained, though no records listed a caretaker. Rains followed the path as far as the public line allowed. Beyond it, the trees grew thicker, but the undergrowth was unusually sparse. He found no litter, no fallen branches, as if someone had been sweeping the forest floor. Further in, he saw a clearing, rectangular in shape, precisely bordered with river stones. In the center was a single wooden post, weathered but intact. No symbols, no plaque, just the post. He recorded its location, took photographs, and left. That evening, he mentioned it during a town council gathering. A man in his 60s, who introduced himself as a former forestry volunteer, listened closely. Afterward, he pulled Rains aside and said, "Don't follow that trail again. The trees don't grow right near there. Always lean east." Rains laughed it off, but the remark stayed with him. He returned to the clearing twice more. The second time, he noticed faint impressions in the soil near the stones, parallel lines perhaps from crates or dragged boards. Each time he visited, the area seemed newly disturbed, as if it had been tended between his visits. He sent a formal report to the county's conservation board. It was filed but not addressed. In 1988, the Abbey's title was quietly transferred to a holding trust affiliated with the order. The name changed, but the property remained listed as religious land. Maintenance was outsourced. A small landscaping crew, hired through an anonymous intermediary, was contracted for quarterly visits. They were given keys to the gate, but instructed never to enter the buildings. One of the workers, Samuel Ortega, remembered the job clearly. The pay was good. The instructions were clear. Trim the outer growth. Do not touch the walls. If a window breaks, report it. Do not look inside. He said he never saw anyone. Yet every third visit something was different. A tool left on the grass was moved. The gravel showed tire marks, though no vehicle was allowed through the gate. Once he found a fresh trail of incense on the air, faint but unmistakable. He followed it toward the chapel, but before reaching the steps, the scent vanished. In 1991, a graduate student at a nearby university began compiling an oral history of religious properties in the Appalachian region. She was unaware of the Abbey's deeper history. Her research was architectural, focused on stonework, layout, and preservation. She sent requests to several known monastic sites. Most declined. One response arrived from an address with no return name. It read, "You may observe the outer gate. You may not cross it." She visited that spring and brought a disposable camera. The outer gate was as described, locked, vine-covered, weather-worn. But as she photographed it, she noticed something unusual. Reflected faintly in the lens was a sliver of glass from an upper window of the guest house. Behind it, she thought she saw movement, a shape shifting briefly before vanishing. When she returned to campus and developed the film, that frame was blank. Not overexposed, not damaged, simply blank. Her professor advised her not to pursue the site further. "Some places," he said, "have been silent too long to be heard correctly." The following decade saw renewed interest in rural monasticism. A group of young seminarians inspired by renewed contemplative trends attempted to contact Holy Cross with a proposal for restoration. They received no response. One of them, years later, would describe the effort as writing letters into a locked room and listening for the echo. Back at the convent, Sister Ruth, now in her 80s, kept a trimmed archive of the documents she had once safeguarded. Much had been sealed or sent elsewhere, but she retained copies of 3 letters. Each was unsigned. Each arrived on the same date over 3 consecutive years. The contents were identical. "We remain within." She never learned who sent them. In 1998, a brief land survey by the state listed the property as uninhabited. The report noted a structure collapse in the southern wing. When an inspector was sent to assess structural risk, he reported that the damage had already been repaired. He had not seen any workers, but the beams were newly reinforced, the rubble cleared. No records showed a permit filed. As the century turned, Holy Cross Abbey ceased to appear in ecclesiastical registries. It was neither active nor closed. It had become a blank designation, land held in trust by an order that no longer listed it on its own rolls. And yet the grounds were maintained. The paths remained swept. The bell rang on Sundays. In the early 2000s, interest in defunct religious properties surged among amateur historians and digital archivists. Websites dedicated to forgotten structures and monastic ruins gained modest popularity. Among them was a forum titled Cloistered Corners, where users shared images of overgrown chapels, cloister walks overtaken by ivy, and monasteries returned to forest. One user, posting under the name Penitent98, uploaded a satellite image of Holy Cross Abbey, citing it as one of the few unentered Cistercian properties east of the Mississippi. The post included coordinates, a historical sketch and speculation that the site had been abandoned since the late 1970s. Most commenters dismissed it. A few offered corrections. One simply wrote, "It's not empty, it's full of what was left." The thread drew attention from a small collective of documentarians focused on institutional histories. In 2005, two of them, under the pseudonyms Jules and Merrin, planned a visual survey of the site. They did not intend to enter the buildings, only to document the exterior and compare architectural features with known Benedictine designs. They arrived in May with cameras, notebooks, and a drone registered to a film school in Pennsylvania. The first footage revealed nothing unusual. The buildings remained intact, weathered but stable. The vineyards had been trimmed unevenly but recently. The chapel's windows reflected the cloud line. But on the second day, while reviewing the footage frame by frame, Jules noticed a sequence in which one upper window appeared briefly ajar. In the next frame, it was closed. The footage was continuous. They returned to the same angle the next morning. The window remained shut. No footprints were visible below, only flattened grass curved in an oval. They did not film further. Jules later explained, "It wasn't fear. It was the sense that we had entered someone's prayer without knocking." They returned their equipment to the university and filed no formal report. In 2009, the monastic order that had once governed Holy Cross underwent consolidation. Several inactive properties were sold to private entities. Holy Cross, however, was not among them. Its deed remained untouched, still held by a trust whose board had not met publicly in over 20 years. No taxes were owed, no declarations made. It existed as a legal fiction, land occupied by no one, maintained by no known agent, never opened, never condemned. In 2011, a quiet review of historical property allocations by a research committee at a Catholic university turned up inconsistencies in Holy Cross's chain of title. A graduate researcher submitted a request to examine the trust documents. Her request was acknowledged, delayed, then marked resolved. No documents were shared. That same year, an elderly nun at a nearby hospice facility passed away. Among her belongings was a small file folder labeled HC Internal. It contained photocopies of monastic rosters, marginalia from a ledger, and a hand-drawn diagram of what appeared to be the north cabins. The diagram included annotations. One phrase stood alone in the corner of the page: "They did not all leave." The hospice nurse who handled the file turned it over to a local historian who archived it with a note: "Origin uncertain, religious reference." By 2015, the monastery had returned to rumor. It was spoken of by name only among those who remembered the area before the highway. To newer residents, it was a story half told. An old stone place with no visitors, no congregation, no services. Yet the grounds were always mowed. Mailboxes were never overfilled. A slow-burning preservation. The silence became, in its own way, institutional. When a surveyor passed through the area in 2017 during a utility upgrade, he noticed fresh wooden signage near the gravel path. The lettering was carved rather than painted. One sign read, "Do not photograph the interior." Another, "Remain in the present." The signs bore no date. The surveyor photographed them but later deleted the images after describing a sense of intrusion. He told his supervisor the job was complete. No one checked further. 2 years later, an academic panel on rural seclusion practices featured a brief presentation referencing Holy Cross. The presenter, a doctoral candidate in theology, had titled her segment "Perpetual Retreat as Identity." She argued that some monastic spaces may enter a state of total enclosure as a form of institutional preservation, no longer engaging with the world, but surviving as closed ecosystems of memory. When asked during the Q&A whether such communities could ever be reopened, she answered, "They are not closed in the way we understand closure. They are simply turned inward." In 2020, drone technology had become ubiquitous. An independent surveyor, hired by a real estate group unrelated to the Abbey, sent a quadcopter over the area for unrelated mapping. As it crossed the outer boundary, the feed grew unstable. A shadow moved across the lower quadrant of the guesthouse roof. The drone's return path was lost. When recovered 2 days later, the footage ended in static. The final readable frame showed what appeared to be a robed figure near the inner garden. The footage was never made public. Today, Holy Cross Abbey remains on the land register. Its gate is rusted in place. Its path is still swept. The bell still rings. No one has entered officially. No one has been confirmed to reside. And yet, each year, around the Feast of the Cross, a new candle appears in the chapel window. It burns for a single night, and by morning it is gone. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.